All right, let's dive in. Today, we're going to unpack the modern story of Cuba. And wow, is it a complicated one. It's a story all about revolution, an incredible amount of resilience, and, well, it's about what happens when you have a superpower just 90 miles off your coast.
So before we jump into all the dates and names, I want you to just think about this for a second. Really try to imagine it. Because this question, it's really the key to getting inside the heads of Cubans at the start of the 20th century.
Okay, so here's where the story really kicks off. Cuba finally gets its independence from Spain. You'd think this would be this huge, triumphant moment, right? A fresh start. But it wasn't nearly that simple. See, instead of getting real, genuine freedom, Cuba basically just swapped one powerful neighbor for another. They found themselves living under the shadow of the United States. And this wasn't some informal agreement. No, the U.S. passed something called the Platt Amendment. It was actual U.S. law that gave America the official power, at least in our own eyes, to call the shots in Cuba. And it all kind of hinges on this one little word, intervene. Think about how much power is packed into that single word. By giving itself the right to intervene whenever it wanted, the U.S. basically put a leash on Cuba's independence from day one. Cuba's ability to actually be its own country was seriously limited right from the get-go.
And listen, this wasn't just some dusty old law on a piece of paper. This had real-world consequences. You had American companies basically owning the most important part of the Cuban economy, sugar. And in politics? Well, if you were a Cuban president who did what the U.S. wanted, you stayed in power. If you didn't, you were out. So for a lot of everyday Cubans, it must have felt like their own government wasn't even working for them. It was working for someone else.
So you've got this pressure from the outside, this American control, and you combine that with some major problems happening inside Cuba. And, well, you've got the perfect storm brewing. A revolution was almost inevitable. Let's take a look at what was pushing things to the absolute breaking point. This chart really says it all, doesn't it? Look at that. You have this tiny, tiny group of wealthy elites holding on to almost everything, all the wealth, all the resources, and then you have, well, everyone else left to fight over the scraps. The vast majority of people were just trying to get by with what was left.
And that struggle was so real. I mean, especially if you lived out in the countryside, you were dealing with crushing poverty. The wages were so low you could barely feed your family. Things we take for granted, like sending your kids to school or seeing a doctor, for most people, that was a complete luxury. And to top it all off, the government was completely corrupt. You can just feel that desire for change just bubbling up, can't you? It was becoming a roar.
Seriously, try to put yourself in their shoes for a minute. Imagine working your tail off every single day, and you still can't make ends meet. Meanwhile, you see a small group of people who have everything. This isn't about politics on TV. This is your life. It's that feeling, that deep, burning sense of injustice that lit the fuse for one of the biggest revolutions of the 20th century. And then, in 1959, it happened. The revolution, led by Fidel Castro, actually succeeded. It completely swept away the old, corrupt system and promised something brand new, something totally radical for Cuba. And that new vision, it was built on the ideas of communism. Now, what does that mean? In simple terms, it meant the government would take control of all the property, all the businesses, with the goal of making sure wealth was spread out much more evenly among everyone. So, what happened next is really complex. It's a story of incredible gains and, at the same time, huge losses. On one hand, the revolution absolutely delivered on some of its biggest promises. Suddenly, healthcare and education were available to everyone, which was a massive change. But there was a huge but. All of this came at the cost of personal freedoms. There was no political dissent allowed, and the government had its hand in every part of the economy. Now, you have to remember what's happening in the rest of the world. The U.S. is in the middle of the Cold War, this massive global standoff with the Soviet Union. So for them, a brand new communist country popping up just 90 miles from Florida, that wasn't just a concern, that was a 5-alarm fire. They saw it as a direct threat, and their reaction was, well, it was swift and it was not friendly. And that hostile reaction very quickly turned into a formal policy, a policy that has shaped and really has strangled Cuba for more than 60 years. We're talking about the U.S. embargo. And as we're about to see, it's something that has gotten way more intense recently. So the embargo kicks off way back in the 60s, but it hasn't stayed the same. Look at this timeline. Fast forward to 2019, and the policy tightened the screws a lot. And then it got even more serious. The U.S. started blocking fuel shipments. At that point, you're not just talking about an embargo anymore. Many people started calling it what it was, a modern-day blockade, aimed right at the country's jugular, its fuel supply.
And let's be clear, cutting off fuel to an entire island nation, that is a massive deal. It's not some small diplomatic move. It immediately threw the entire country into a severe energy crisis. It basically paralyzed daily life.
And you can see the domino effect right here. It's absolutely devastating. You cut off the fuel, right? Okay, so then the power plants can't run. That means no reliable electricity, which means hospitals struggle to keep the lights on, let alone run life-saving equipment. It means farmers can't run their equipment and trucks can't deliver food. Water pumps stop working. Schools and businesses have to close. It's just this cascade of crises that hits every single person, every single day.
So again, let's just pause and think about the human side of this. Forget the high-level politics for a second. Imagine your power being out for days or weeks at a time. Imagine not knowing if the hospital can help you. Would it feel fair if all of this was happening because of pressure from another country? This really gets to the core of the whole debate, doesn't it?
And of course, there are two very different ways of looking at this. On one side, you have supporters of the blockade who say, look, this intense pressure is the only way to force the Cuban government to change its ways. But on the other side, you have critics who say, hold on, this isn't hurting the government leaders. It's creating a massive humanitarian crisis that punishes 11 million ordinary people.
So, after all of this long, complicated, and frankly, painful history, where does that leave Cuba today?
Well, the story is definitely not over. Today, Cuba is still caught in this incredible vice. On one side, you have the crushing pressure from the U.S. blockade, and on the other, they're grappling with their own big internal challenges. It's really a nation that has been defined by struggle, but also by an incredible will to survive.
And I think that's the most important thing to remember. None of this is ancient history. The Platt Amendment from over 100 years ago, the revolution, the embargo, these aren't just lines in a textbook. They are active forces that are still shaping the day-to-day lives of millions of people right now as we speak.
So we'll leave you with this final thought. Learning about a story like Cuba's, it's not just about understanding another country. It's about seeing in really stark terms how huge political decisions made by people in power can have profound, life-altering consequences for real, everyday people. And it makes you wonder, right? How does learning about their struggles for fairness and justice make us think about those same ideas right here in our own communities? It's definitely something to chew on.